If you are very active on the social media space, you would know that Americans are one of those citizens who believe that the US is the best country in the world. Americans believe that the US is the champion of freedom, justice, and equity. So, they believe everything their government tells them about countries like China, Russia, and even Africa. They believe everything without doing proper research, even though the internet is very much available. Now, for a long time, the US government has told Americans that China is a repressive government and a threat to US national security. Americans believed this until a few days ago when the proposed TikTok ban led to a series of events that finally exposed Americans to the truth. Most US content creators on TikTok and their followers are now aware of what the rest of the world already knows. But how did it all unfold? Let's find out. The US prides itself as the land of the free and the champion of democracy. But it seems US politicians forgot all that the US supposedly stands for when it decided to ban TikTok without the consent of the 170 million American content creators on the site. It all began on April 24, 2024, when former President Joe Biden signed a bipartisan TikTok bill, which gave Chinese parent company ByteDance 6 months to sell its controlling stake or be blocked in the US. However, TikTok rejected the notion of selling and filed a lawsuit, calling it an extraordinary intrusion on free speech rights. The US government, in return, filed a lawsuit against TikTok, accusing it of allegedly collecting children's data and failing to respond when parents tried to delete their children's accounts. Fast forward to December 6, 2024, a federal appeal court rejected TikTok's bid to overturn a law that would see it banned or sold in the US from early 2025. And then on December 27th, President Trump asks the US Supreme Court to delay the upcoming ban while he works on a political resolution. However, on the 10th of January 2025, the US Supreme Court and 9 justices heard oral arguments about the suits. Lawyers representing TikTok and content creators stated that the ban would be a violation of free speech protections for the platform's more than 170 million users in the US. However, most of the justices homed in on one central point. Axios' Sam Baker reports, which claimed that law would allow TikTok to keep operating if it used an algorithm other than the one created by ByteDance. And ByteDance, as a Chinese company, doesn't have First Amendment rights. Unfortunately, on January 17, 2025, the US Supreme Court upheld the law that bans TikTok in the US unless its China-based parent company ByteDance sells the platform by Sunday, January 19th. In response, TikTok announced that it would go dark on that day. Ahead of the Sunday ban, TikTok shut down its service to American users. Those who tried to open the app were greeted with a message with the headline, "Sorry, TikTok isn't available right now." Now, according to US lawmakers and politicians, TikTok's supposed ties to China pose a threat to the US national security. They say that the Chinese government could use it as a vehicle to spy on Americans or covertly influence the US public by amplifying or suppressing certain content. They say that the concern is warranted because Chinese national security laws require organizations to cooperate with intelligence gathering. In April 2024, Representative Michael McCall, a Texas Republican, compared it to a spy balloon in Americans' phones, while Senator Chris Coons, a Democrat from Delaware, said that lawmakers learned in classified briefings how rivers of data are being collected and shared in ways that are not well aligned with American security interests. However, according to Republican Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky, most of the reasons the government banned it were based on accusations, not proof. He said that TikTok has never been tried and found guilty of sharing information with the Chinese Communist government. This is quite interesting. The US went ahead to enforce a ban that restricted America's rights without any proof or evidence. How exactly is that democratic or constitutional? Before we proceed, here is a reminder to like this video, drop a comment, and subscribe to our channel so that you can get more videos like this. Now, according to the American Civil Liberties Union, the US government ought to meet an extraordinarily high bar to ban an entire communications platform under the First Amendment. To ban TikTok, the government must show that the ban is the only way to prevent serious, imminent harm to national security, and that the ban limits no more speech than necessary to accomplish that purpose. But with no proof or evidence, the government has not come close to meeting that standard. During the Supreme Court ruling, the Department of Justice argued that the ban has two purposes. One is to limit the Chinese government's ability to covertly manipulate what Americans see on TikTok, and two, to prevent the Chinese government from accessing Americans' data. According to the ACLU, there is no evidence that TikTok is being exploited in either of these ways, nor satisfies the First Amendment high bar. Despite all these, the US government went ahead with the ban, but here is where it gets interesting. With the notice of the potential ban circulating around, American content creators took to TikTok to air their views. Most of them agreed that the government's decision was not constitutional or democratic. According to them, the rights and voices of the 170 million content creators were not taken into consideration. This is ironic given the fact that America is supposed to be a democratic nation, which means the majority rules. However, in this case, the minority comprising only a few lawmakers overruled the choice of 170 million Americans. This was the first eye-opener for Americans. Secondly, the US government alleges that TikTok is a threat to the country's national security. But Americans are left wondering how exactly a platform where people upload ridiculous things could be a threat. Besides this, TikTok has been in existence since 2016. So if truly it was a threat, then something dangerous must have happened by now. The US government alleged that the Chinese government could use TikTok to influence Americans by amplifying or suppressing certain content. But there is no evidence that such a thing has ever happened since the existence of TikTok. Throughout all these years on TikTok, Americans remain the same people with the same ideology that the world revolves around them. So, obviously, something else is at play. The worst part for American content creators was the fact that they would lose a potential source of income. In frustration, some really smart Americans started to dig and they uncovered something. They discovered that some of the politicians who strongly supported the TikTok ban bill dubbed "protecting Americans' sensitive data from foreign adversaries" bought shares from Meta just before the bill was passed. You see, TikTok is Meta's biggest competitor, and just imagine how much profit Meta would make if TikTok happens to leave American soil. Prior to the ban, projections indicated that TikTok's 2024 digital ad revenue could hit up to $18.5 billion. By comparison, Meta's ad sales marked just $13 billion in 2023. So, if TikTok is forced to leave the US, advertisers on TikTok would be forced to pivot back to Meta's properties, delivering a hefty chunk of change back into Mark Zuckerberg's pockets and that of his investors. One such US politician who bought Meta shares is Republican Michael McCaul. In March 2024 alone, actively bought Meta shares in 5 batches. The value of the purchases ranges between $50,000 and $250,000 each. So doesn't it seem suspicious that he is at the forefront of the ban on TikTok? In a statement, he said that CCP-controlled TikTok is an enormous threat to US national security, and that the Senate must pass this bill and send it to the president's desk immediately. Other US politicians who supported the bill and also own Meta stock include Nancy Pelosi and Markwayne Mullin. Americans put all these together and concluded that their government was corrupt. But it gets even more interesting. It's not exactly clear who was the first American to decide that since the government was banning TikTok because of China, then it would make sense to move to Redbook, a social media app fully owned by China. It's kind of ironic that the law that was supposed to drive Americans away from China is what brought Americans to China. Following the intended TikTok ban, American content creators began to move to Redbook, which, unlike TikTok, is fully owned by China. And to everyone's surprise, the exchange was amazing. Americans were surprised at the warm welcome from the Chinese. Both citizens swapped jokes and memes in what one user described as a historic moment. As a result of the influx of Americans in what was purely a Chinese platform, RedNote's US popularity surged. The app climbed to the top of Apple's US App Store, amassing 700,000 downloads in just 2 days, catching RedNote's Shanghai-based parent company off guard. The cultural exchange between countries that have long been rivals was amazing. In fact, many Americans on the app have declared that even if TikTok remains in the US, they would not leave RedNote. Aside from the fact that the exchange was welcoming, it was also eye-opening, especially for Americans. Now, as we said at the beginning of this video, Americans have always believed whatever their government says about other countries. For a long time, Western media has told Americans that China is a communist government, which automatically means that it is a repressive government. They told them that Chinese citizens do not have rights and are suffering. The US government has also told Americans that China is notable for stealing or copying technology. This propaganda by the US government about China has warped the minds of Americans, making them see the Chinese in a different way. However, they were shocked to discover that the fact that China doesn't practice democracy doesn't mean that the government is repressive or the citizens are suffering. Americans on Red Note discovered that China is more advanced than the US under the so-called repressive government. A Chinese person can buy a house at a very affordable rate and doesn't have to pay property taxes. This is in contrast to the US, whereby buying a house doesn't mean that you own the house. Rent is cheap in China, food is cheap, and the healthcare is dope. The citizens of China are happy. The technology is way more advanced than that of the US. If this was truly a repressive regime like the US government claims, all these things would not be possible. Although Red Note censored some content about sensitive issues such as pornography and LGBT, the fact is that the rest of the world is not America. There are so many countries in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia that consider this offensive, and that is their choice. The problem with the US is that it thinks it knows better and its choices are the best. But people have their cultures and traditions, and freedom means that these people should be allowed to make their own choices. Enforcing your own belief is actually suppressing freedom. It was a truly eye-opening experience for Americans on Red Note, as many of them said that they had been lied to by their government. Now, this will teach Americans to not just believe everything the government tells them. The truth is that there is no data theft threat from China. China does not care about stealing data from Americans through TikTok. The truth is that the US government simply wants to control the information accessible to Americans. Ironically, it's the exact same thing that it has accused China of doing. But we should not be surprised. We have seen it play over and over again. It doesn't matter what the US does, it's always right. But if another country does it, it's a problem. The US cut off RT last year not just in the US but also in Africa, without the consent of Africans. Nobody, including Western media, condemned or called it suppression of free speech, which is exactly what it is. But when the military leaders of the Sahel region did the same thing to the French news media, it was condemned and called suppression of free speech. Americans might just know this now, but the rest of the world knows that the supposed champion of justice and freedom is the worst abuser of human rights. The US is a bully, and under the guise of protecting national security, has carried out nefarious activities that have harmed many nations. A good example is Libya. The only thing Americans know about Libya is the fact that NATO stepped in to save the citizens from a dictator, Muammar Gaddafi. But the truth is that the US took out Gaddafi because he was a threat. The so-called protest that made NATO supposedly intervene was made up of a group of a ragtag, disparate collection of local and tribal militias, Islamist fighters, and disaffected soldiers united only by their opposition to Gaddafi. During the conflict in 2011, the US media amplified claims that the Libyan Air Force was bombing demonstrators, despite statements by top Pentagon officials that there was no confirmation whatsoever that such bombing was happening. Western media outlets and politicians accused Gaddafi of carrying out a systematic mass slaughter of civilians and of intending to do more of the same, particularly as government forces advanced on rebel-held Benghazi. But there was no evidence of such slaughter. During Gaddafi's rule, Libya was the most economically stable African country. They had no debts and had a free healthcare system and education. But the US did not like him. Just like in the Sahel region, Gaddafi kicked Western military bases out of the country and distanced himself from the West. We all know that the West doesn't want that, so they concocted lies and made him a dictator as a justification to kill him. In March 2011, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 1973, which authorized all necessary measures to protect civilians. NATO dubiously interpreted the resolution as granting it the right to overthrow the Libyan government. NATO forces, primarily Britain, France, and the US, subsequently conducted roughly 9,700 strike sorties and dropped over 7,000 precision-guided bombs during their 7-month campaign. The bombing not only ensured victory for the rebels but also killed scores of the civilians it claimed to be protecting and left Libya without a functioning government. It's been more than 10 years and Libya is still destabilized. A so-called dictator was able to make his country economically stable without the help of the West, which is what every government ought to give their citizens. Meanwhile, the so-called democratic African nations hailed by the US as stable democracies are struggling under debt, with more citizens living under the poverty line. NATO killed Gaddafi for supposedly suppressing the rights of the citizens, and yet, the US is ignoring the rights of her citizens to ban TikTok. The fact is that the US government is hypocritical, and now Americans know this too. Interestingly, President Trump announced on Sunday that he planned to issue the order to give TikTok's China-based parent company more time to find an approved buyer before the popular video-sharing platform is subject to a permanent US ban. As a result, TikTok has started to restore service to users in the United States. In his post on Sunday, Trump said he would like the United States to have a 50% ownership position in a joint venture, but it was not immediately clear if he was referring to the government or a US company. By doing this, we save TikTok, keep it in good hands, and allow it to stay up, Trump wrote. However, it is unclear if ByteDance is interested in selling. But it's interesting that Trump is trying to save TikTok, given the fact that he was the one who started talking about TikTok being a national security in his first team. It would be interesting to see how it will unfold. What are your thoughts? Let us know in the comments section below. Don't forget to like this video, drop a comment, and share this video.